Recording. Okay, shalom. Hello, hello. Okay, so we have with us Rabbi Chaim Shalom from Jerusalem, from Kehilat Mevakshei Derech. And you can say a few words about the Kehillah if you want, Chaim. And it's wonderful to be able to talk here with you today. And we're actually talking because of a sad occurrence of the passing away of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, if I'm correct. Nachon? Nachon? No. And because Ken, you are from the Eda of Yahadut Anglia, the Jews of England, I thought it would be really, really interesting and informative for all of us here in Edmonton to hear about Rabbi Sachs and to hear your perspective about him. And then I thought we could have a short conversation also about our ability to relate and be part of those portions of Am Yisrael that don't actually accept us fully. But in what way are we able to be part of this relationship? So, Bakasha.
Absolutely.
Over to you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Gila. My name's Chaim Shalom. I'm the rabbi of Kehilat Mevakshei Derech, which is in the San Simon neighborhood of Jerusalem. We're a Mordechai Kaplan-inspired progressive congregation. And about 20 years ago, we joined the Israeli progressive movement, which is now known as the Israeli Reform movement. But our version of reform is not really based on North American reform. But nevertheless, we share all the values of egalitarianism, democratic Judaism, etc. As you probably can hear, I'm not a native Israeli, despite my very Israeli-sounding name, Chaim Shalom. I was born as James Taylor in Manchester, England. And growing up in England, I got to obviously be affected by and learn from Rabbi Sachs. You insisted on calling him Rabbi Lord Sachs. He was indeed a lord and a peer of the realm, but I'm a committed anti-monarchist and believe that the House of Lords should be got rid of. So he represented us wonderfully in the House of Lords, but I think of him as a rabbi rather than as his position within the British government. And you'd like me to say a few words about him and...
Yes. Yeah. No, the Lord thing, I was trying to be correct and polite. I don't know how it's interesting.
100% correct. He was a Lord.
Ken, and I was wondering how, it's interesting to think about, I don't know if you know how he felt about, was he using that title at all when he was talking about himself?
No, he was proud to be Baron Sachs of Aldgate. He considered it an honor, as well as being a leader of the Jewish community. He was very, very much a celebrated figure amongst all British people. If you belong to a certain, educational class, one might call it, his voice would be very, very familiar because he was always on a certain set of programs on the radio where he was invited to give, a word from a religious leader. And he was probably invited just as often as the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York and all the major Christian figures. So he was very British in his making, and he was very proud to be British. And he was very proud to serve a small part in British government.
Yeah, and that's so. Do you know if there have been other British rabbis who had been knighted in any way?
Yeah, actually. So this is with him. It became a trend, as it were. Essentially, his predecessor, Lord Jacobowitz, was also made into a lord when he retired from being the chief rabbi. Lord Sachs was actually made before he retired, I believe. But yes, essentially the way, because like Canada, we have no separation of religion and state in the UK, because like Canada, we are technically a monarchy and ruled by the Queen. but more so than Canada, this actually plays out in our actual government. And so the House of Lords has within it a bunch of bishops who sit as lords. I've forgotten the term for them, but they don't really vote on anything and do anything whilst they're actually bishops. But then when they retire, they become real members of the House of Lords, where they do vote and all those things, which has actually caused a recent controversy because the first black bishop to retire was not given this conventional honor, and many people believe that that's because the current government, which is a conservative government, has acted in a racist manner. But anyway, so it's convention that when the archbishops retire, they become lords, and in fact all the bishops. And so this was kind of expanded to Lord Jacobowitz and then Lord Sachs. And I imagine when the next imam of or the chief imam of the Muslim Council of Britain retires, he will also be made into a lord, which of course goes back to the inherent patriarchy in a system which doesn't separate between religion and state. But that's a whole other thing.
That's a different conversation and a fascinating one at that. But I think this touches upon what Rabbi Sachs meant for the Jewish community and as a representative of the Jewish community, which is Ken. So that was important. So maybe tell us a bit about Rabbi Sachs and who he was and how you felt about him.
Okay, yeah. So Rabbi Sachs was a unique figure within British Jewry, and I imagine we're unlikely to see his like again. British Jewry is a Jewry where, even though most people are not practicing Orthodoxy, they affiliate and identify with the Orthodox stream. This is becoming less and less so, but it's still true now, and it was even more so in 1990 when Rabbi Sachs became the chief rabbi of the United Synagogues. So the United Synagogues is a London-based, only London, I'm from Manchester, it's only London, a London-based Orthodox grouping of synagogues. They choose their chief rabbi, and then certain people recognize that chief rabbinate as holding for the whole of Great Britain and even the whole of the Commonwealth. And whether one is reform or liberal or conservative or whatever one's identification is, when someone says the chief rabbi, everyone knows what you're talking about. Even if at various points, people, including like myself, would say, well, he's not my chief rabbi. He's only the chief rabbi of the Orthodox. That's all very well and good, but everyone still knew that if you say the chief rabbi, who you were talking about. And Rabbi Sachs was appointed because he had stood out in two ways. One, he was exceptionally learned. He hadn't come from a great rabbinic dynasty. He's not someone whose fathers were all rabbis in the shtetl. But rather, he was very Jewishly learned, and actually most of his Jewish learning was after being inspired by the Jewry of North America. He went as a young man to North America and had a trip there, and that's what made him want to commit himself to Jewish learning and becoming a rabbi. And he was very learned, but he was also exceptionally intelligent. Not just in Jewish learning was he learned, but he had gone to Cambridge, Oxford. He'd gone to one of the better British universities, either Cambridge, I think, pretty sure Cambridge. And Gonville and Keys, yes, Cambridge. And he was exceptionally fluent in the intellectual philosophy of the West. And this was pretty rare for a modern Orthodox rabbi at the time. And he'd been earmarked to be the next chief rabbi when Lord Jakobovits resigned, and that came to pass. And he was pretty young in 1990 when he was asked to be the chief rabbi. I mean, so he must have been 42, my age now, in fact, because he passed away this year, and that's 30 years ago, and he was 72. And he was unprepared for the politics of it. He was very learned and very erudite and very eloquent, but he wasn't a good politician. And the moment that he entered, the rabbis to the right of him, as it were, the rabbis who were more strict, what we might call Haredi in Israel, or ultra-Orthodox, tried to essentially play him. And they engineered it so he was forced to give his opinion on what was then the budding new conservative movement. Early on in his chief rabbinate, he was asked, what he thought about them and how he would act towards them, which is particularly an acute issue in England, because unlike in North America, where the conservative movement was a split off of Reform, in the UK, the conservative movement was a split off of Orthodoxy. The person who founded the first conservative synagogue in England was Rabbi Louis Jacobs, who had started his life as an Orthodox rabbi, and he too was primed to be chief rabbi back in the 1950s, and he wrote a book called Reason to Believe, and because of that he was disbarred from the Orthodox rabbinate and sent away. And from the synagogue that he founded after being thrown out of Orthodoxy grew the conservative movement. It took another 30 years for it to grow into a movement. And so just as Rabbi Sachs was beginning his job as chief rabbi, the conservative movement was growing, and he said what he believed he had to say, which was that conservative Judaism is not real Judaism. And that got him in some level of political trouble, because as the chief rabbi, and I'm not sure whether it's ever it's really true or it's an urban myth, but when I grew up, I believe that he was actually appointed by the Queen to be the chief rabbi of the Commonwealth, which may well be true. But the point is, he was clearly, even though he was an Orthodox chief rabbi, he was meant to represent all Jews. And so that got him in some trouble, but the trouble really started in 1996. I was 18 at the time, and Rabbi Hugo Grim passed away. Rabbi Hugo Grim was the senior rabbi of the West London Synagogue of Great British Jews. The West London Synagogue of Great British Jews was the first Reform synagogue in England, founded in 1840. Actually, amongst the founders were some of my ancestors, founded by Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews coming together who wanted to be, as the name suggests, British rather than Ashkenazi or Sephardi Jews, and also wanted to express how British they were. That was part of their reformness. So it was the first Reform shul in England, and it is the flagship Reform synagogue. Rabbi Grim passed away in 1996, and once again the people to the right of Rabbi Sachs tried to essentially cause trouble for him. So he was pressured not to go to the funeral of Rabbi Grim. But on the other hand, there was also pressure from the other side of people who believed that, we should try and be a united community. It doesn't matter if you're Reform or Orthodox, can't we all get along and show respect? And I think also by his own personal desire, he also wanted to show respect, and so he went to the memorial of Rabbi Grim that was held in Westminster Abbey. If you're wondering why it's appropriate for a rabbi to have a memorial service in an abbey, as am I. But that's long history. Anyway, so he went along to the memorial, and he received a lot of criticism from his right wing. And in order to calm down this criticism, he wrote a letter in Talmudic Hebrew, not quite sure why that's relevant, but everyone's been mentioning it as they discuss this issue. But he wrote a letter to the Dayanim, to the religious judges of the ultra-Orthodox community, saying that, don't worry, he was still an implacable enemy of all Reform people, and he still did believe that Rabbi Grim led people into away from Judaism, and all the things that they wanted him to say. Of course, this was a private letter, and of course it was leaked. It was leaked to the Jewish press and then to the regular press with translation. And it was very, very hurtful to many Reform Jews at the time. I certainly being one of them, as an 18-year-old, I'd grown up Reform all my life. My mother's family had been deeply involved in West London Synagogue. That's where my grandparents had been married. And it was very hurtful. And there were lots of, he's not my chief rabbi, etc. And there's no question that he'd made a political mistake, and that political mistake had hurt people.
Can you say something for a moment, just so people understand, what's the relationship between the Orthodox and Reform and liberal sections in British Jewry? How big is Reform and liberal Judaisms?
Okay, yeah, so that's a good question. So traditionally, the middle of the road Orthodoxy, so that's what the United Synagogue is, and then also it has affiliate branches. So they're not part of the United Synagogue, but they're essentially the same as, but in other places other than London. They took up about 70% of British Jewry. Well, once upon a time, when most of British Jews affiliated to a synagogue, 70% of all those who affiliated would affiliate to a United Synagogue or a United Hebrew Congregation synagogue, a middle of the road Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy. They would have about 70% of the of those people. About 15% used to be to the left of that. So that would be, traditionally was Reform and Liberal. There were two different movements, both progressive movements, both essentially affiliated to what's Reform in Canada and the US. And the Reform movement is the more traditional of those two. And that used to have about 10% of British Jews, and the liberal movement would have about 5%. And then there was also Jews to the more religious, more Orthodox, more traditional side, another 15% of Jews, mostly in three small patches of the country. Once upon a time, that would be Hackney, Stamford Hill. There's a kind of Jewish ghetto in northeast London. And Manchester, my hometown, has a section of ultra-Orthodox Jews, and very bizarrely, a small ghetto in Gateshead, which would be the equivalent of, if you can imagine, I don't know, somewhere in Saskatchewan, there being a small little shtetl of Haredim, because it's far off north. It's very incongruous.
There actually were small shtetls in Saskatchewan, but not anymore. Okay. There you go.
But what exactly? You expect them once upon a time when people arrived, and then they realized, no, they don't want to share their breakfast with Paul. So the mainstream Orthodoxy was completely dominant. That's changed a bit. The Reform movement has grown to 12% rather than 10%, and there's now a Masorti movement with a 5% share as well. And what we've mostly seen is that more and more Jews are choosing not to affiliate. What happens, I served a Reform congregation in Manchester, England, where I'm from, not the congregation I grew up in, but I served there, and what we found was that many people who grew up in Orthodoxy but didn't actually practice Orthodoxy wouldn't choose to go back when they were adults for one reason or another. Often the reason being, of course, that they had found non-Jewish partners and they weren't welcome in Orthodoxy. And we were obviously very happy to welcome them and their partners, whether or not their partners were thinking about conversion. Obviously, if they thought about conversion, then they would rather do it with us, the Reform movement, than the Orthodoxy. And also, if they didn't think about conversion, we would be happy to have these wonderful Jewish families raising Jewish kids, even if one of the parents wasn't Jewish. And, you know, we were happy to open our doors to these wonderful people who were willing to, for some reason, marry into the Jewish community. Strange people. No, you're all wonderful people. We love you, even if we don't quite understand why you put up with us. And so the relationship was always one of dominance by Orthodoxy. I grew up, you know, growing up Reform in a school where there was a number of Jewish kids. You know, I was picked on for not being Orthodox. It was bizarre, you know, and that played out also to some extent in geography. You know, Manchester has a big Jewish community, but they all live in the north of Manchester. I lived in South Manchester, which clearly meant that I was, you know, a snob and a Reform person who thought he was better than the rest, and you know, and so there was a lot of animosity once upon a time. So
that was getting you ready for life in Israel as a Reformed Jew.
Yes, exactly. Great preparation.
Yeah,
where essentially the situation is the same, that the majority of people aren't Orthodox, but the Judaism that they recognize as Judaism is Orthodoxy.
Yeah. And what was Rabbi Sachs's relationship with liberal and Reform Judaism as he, you know, matured and grew up?
Exactly.
Was there ever,
Yeah, so 1996 is already 24 years ago, and what happened afterwards, I think, was that as he grew into the role of chief rabbi and he no longer felt that he needed to answer to the ultra-Orthodox authorities to the right of him, he was able to assert who he was himself. And who he was himself was someone who was deeply committed to Orthodoxy. He did believe that Reform Judaism was wrong. But more than that, he was deeply committed to Judaism. And the Judaism that he was committed to taught him that all Jews are Jews, all people are people, and all people deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. And even though he had made a mistake and it was hard for him to publicly say sorry, he never really did, although he did say privately to Rabbi Grim's widow, he actually then essentially spent the next 24 years, I think, on some level making tshuva for that and making up for that. Not that
give
really
examples? In what ways? Like in what ways do you think that he was doing that?
He led many efforts within the Orthodox world that, though they weren't specifically centered around trying to create bridges between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews, they certainly were around creating a sense of Klal Yisrael amongst British Jews, a sense of we're all in this together. And also he adopted a number of measures which clearly he also understood, you know, would never have come to Orthodoxy had they not come from non-Orthodoxy first. You know, he was a leader of women's rights within Orthodoxy. He encouraged women's minions. He encouraged, you know, the testing of the boundaries of halakha in terms of how much women can be included. He was at the forefront of moves by Orthodox communities, in particular Orthodox schools, to create safe spaces within Orthodox communities for LGBTQ young Jews and Jews generally. And he was a champion of the values that we share in common, Reform and him as an Orthodox Jew. You know, he believed in accessibility of the tradition. He believed in welcoming. He believed in treating people with dignity, and he did what he could to represent all Jews, also those who weren't Orthodox. And, you know, when you heard him speak, I was lucky enough to hear him speak on a number of occasions. I was involved as a Jewish student leader, and I was at Hebrew University for a junior year abroad, and he'd always come and speak to the students there. And so I heard him in Israel, I heard him in England. When you heard him speak, he would often be called upon to one way or the other, either by someone who was still resentful, who wasn't Orthodox and still resented maybe the slight that they perceived he'd given, or the opposite, someone who was Orthodox who wanted him to say some form of anti-reform or anti-non-Orthodox position. And he developed, and obviously he didn't have that maybe in his first 6 years as chief rabbi, but after a while he certainly developed a way to take away the sting, take away the animosity. And actually, in the last 25 years, maybe the biggest thing that's been seen in the Jewish community in the UK is the ability to build bridges and the ability to build shared institutions. A long time ago, there were very few places in the UK. When I was growing up in the UK, there were very few places where Reform and Orthodox Jews met. Now it's the opposite. When you think of Jewish communal events, you think of everyone coming together, and it's kind of incidental as to what where you chose to pray on a Shabbat. The largest institutions of the Jewish community today are three institutions that are all very good at being cross-communal. We've got Limud, obviously, which probably many of the people in Canada know about and have heard about. It's now a worldwide phenomenon, but it was originally British, even though it was actually based on a North American model, the CAGE conference. They took it to the UK and then did something very different with it. So that's one thing which is deeply cross-communal and really has a sense of valuing everyone. Then we've got JW3, the large Jewish community centre in northwest London. The JW3 is a play on its postal code, NW3. So it's a huge Jewish community centre, exceptionally popular, exceptionally busy. It's really become the centre of Jewish life. And it's run by someone who went on a Reform-sponsored gap year, and is a Reform Jew essentially, or is a non-Orthodox Jew certainly. And then the final one is the UJA, which is essentially the Federation for British people, which has grown over time because the chief rabbi chose to use that as his vehicle more than he used his own United Synagogues. He wanted to ensure his drive when he was chief rabbi in his early years, which is something I don't agree with once again, but this is what he wanted to do, was around a slogan that was meaningful to him and meaningful to many people called Jewish continuity. And the idea was, we need to work hard to make sure our kids remain Jewish and stay Jewish. And this involved a lot of things, but mostly about Jewish education. There's some less pleasant pieces in there about, how do we stop intermarriage, which obviously I wouldn't get behind, but that was his main drive. And it was for all Jews. It wasn't for the people who were in his pews alone, of the United Synagogue. So he used the UJA and he lifted up the UJA to be a much more central institution. So today, British Jewry is one of the communities that is more united than any that I've seen around the world. In America, there aren't the tensions that once were in British Jewry, but that's simply because most non-Orthodox Jews don't really think about Orthodox Jews and what's going on. And the Orthodox Jews know that they're a tiny minority, not tiny minority anymore, they're growing and growing. But in America, rather than Canada, they're a minority and they just don't care what's happening to the rest of the Jewish community. In America, the Jewish community is big enough and integrated enough into American society that there's no need for them to be unified. But if you look at the other countries in the world, Canada may be among them, Jews still feel very much as a community. But in many places, they are a very much divided community. There's a lot of bitterness in many places amongst Reform Jews for the ways in which they're kept out of communal institutions. And while he didn't do it very much from the forefront. Rabbi Sachs was very much involved in making sure that the pressures from within the community, which exploded by him being tricked into making his political mistakes, were sewn together again. We did have real fissures, and I feel like there's still plenty of resentment, and there's still huge amounts of ideological gaps and real arguments. But there is also a sense that we all are part of one community, even when, quite rightly, Orthodox rabbis believe that some of the people in our synagogues who we consider Jewish, for them, they're not Jewish. And that's their right to say, in my eyes, this person hasn't gone through a process that really makes them Jewish. Now, it may be painful to us, but there's no reason, I don't believe we can say, no, you must accept our conversions. That's not how religion works. And unfortunately, in England, Canada, America, anywhere outside of Israel, Jewishness is primarily a religion.
We can talk about that at another time. It's a whole different subject. Okay, so no, it's just two things open, and we need to start closing this. But
yes, I'm sorry.
But I did not know. But two things came up for me. One was how interesting and important it is that actually the way British Jewry around Rabbi Sachs's leadership managed to put the synagogues to the side in a sense, and the centrality of synagogue life and the Bet Knesset to the side, and find a way of coming together and create new Batei Knesset for themselves, basically, which are not the religious Batei Knesset, not the religious synagogues, but actually real communal spaces. And I'm wondering how, and we don't need to answer this now, but I'm just opening it up as a question, how this could actually inform our reality here in Canada, but also, I think, our reality in Israel. And we've had these conversations, and the Reform movement is trying to have it. I'm not sure if successfully, but yeah. So I think this is a very interesting model to look at and realize the power of this way of being in the world. And maybe just to close this, we both saw, we were part of a conversation after Rabbi Sachs's death, and of the ability and inability of people to from a place of hurt to actually mourn him because of the situations that you were talking about. But maybe you can say a few words just to close about this ability to mourn those who don't accept us.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess the conversation you're referring to was a difficult one for me to be a part of, I guess, because I really felt like I was mourning. From the 18-year-old who was deeply hurt by what had been done, many years have passed, and 24 years later, when I hear the name Rabbi Sachs, I think of the incredible wellsprings of Torah that he's given to the world, mostly, nearly all of it, entirely driven towards creating a better world, towards the kind of vision of Tikkun that I see very much at the center of my own Jewish vision. And so for me to still be hung up about, something that was 24 years ago, and everyone knows the political pressures that he was under, and yes, he made a mistake. But for me, for that to still be the Ikar seems to be, it was very hard for me to see the people who were still pained by that and wanted to make it clear that even though, yes, he may have been a great Torah scholar, he wasn't perfect. I don't think anyone believes that anyone is perfect. But to still think that the Ikar of his work was that one or two mistakes, or however many mistakes, rather than this huge body. He's written 25 books. He has a huge social media presence. He's got a website. He's changed the conversation in many places around what it is to be Jewish. And and what can be brought from the Jewish tradition to the modern age, was to me, it was to completely miss the point. And I guess I just felt it was so very, very sad. I think of some of the mistakes I've made with my life, and I really hope that when I'm gone, that's not, I'm not going to be remembered for my mistakes. I think there's something basic and human and humane in saying, at the point of death, that not just look at only the good, but look at the overall effect of someone's life. Not just only look at the good. There's a saying popular in Israel based on a series of Parashot HaShavua, Achrei Mot Kedoshim Emor. There's three parashot, that's their name, Achrei Mot, after the death, Kedoshim, holy, Emor, speak. And the idea is that when someone dies, you only speak of them as holy. And you can agree with that and not agree with that. But I think even if you don't agree with that, even if we're not trying to make someone into a saint, who obviously wasn't a saint, I think we can, it should be clear that overall this is someone who did a huge amount of good in the world. And for me, it was very painful that other people were still wanting to, what to me felt like score points. Now, the truth is, there were lots of those conversations. Also, his obituary in the Times newspaper of London was attacked by some as being point scoring, and was hailed by others as being a truthful telling of his life. So it goes both ways. Some people will feel like I'm painting over or plastering over a sin which caused people lots of harm. He's not the only he's not the only celebrity, as it were, who's passed away recently. Sean Connery recently passed away, and there were those who wanted to celebrate his life, and there were those who wanted to talk about what he'd said about domestic abuse. And essentially it seemed that he thought that domestic abuse was okay, and obviously that's a horrible, terrible thing, lahavdil elef havdalot, which means without wanting to make any connection back to Rabbi Sacks. But it's true of us all. When we pass away, how are we going to be remembered? And I guess I remember Rabbi Sacks as someone who, yes, made a mistake, but in the end learned from that mistake and used that mistake, I think, to power a lot of good in the world. And I hope that good will be remembered.
Thank you very much. Toda rabba. Thank you very much. And I think for me, it comes back to my question with our ability as liberal, reform, egalitarian Jews to allow our opponents to also be human, and not to hold them up to places that we don't hold ourselves up to. So, hamakom yenachem otcha. And thank you very much for joining us. And enjoy the beginning of Yerushalayim's winter.
Indeed. Geshem, Geshem ba.
Geshem, Geshem ba. Thank you.